Good evening. Can you hear me okay? All right. Hi, I am Karen Newrohr, and I'm the Science Cafe Coordinator for the OSU Library. This is our 6th year to offer science cafes at the OSU Library and in the Stillwater community. So welcome to Science Cafe tonight. Our partners for Science Cafe, besides the OSU Library, are the Vice President for Research, Dr. Kenneth Sewell, and the Sigma Xi Scientific Research Society, and the president of Sigma Xi is here with us tonight, Dr. Udaya Da Silva. Dr. Da Silva. So thank you all for coming. We have an exciting program for you tonight that we have been hoping to get for a couple of years now, so we finally were able to book these speakers. And for our Science Cafe tonight, we have several student organizations that are program partners. The Kasner Student Council, anyone here from that group? Okay, they may be having a meeting tonight. The Natural Resource Ecology and Management Graduate Student Organization, anyone here? All right, we've got several, great. Tri Beta National Biological Honor Society. Wildlife Disease Association. Oh, look at all the hands. Great. Wildlife Society. Okay, I see some hands there. Great. Zoo Exotics and Wildlife. Wonderful. And the Zoology Graduate Student Society. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for coming and serving as program partners. So the program format tonight, after I have finished these introductions, are to do about 3 trivia questions, and I'll have prizes for those. And then we will have our Science Cafe presentations by Dr. Fairbanks and Ms. Lyda. And then at the end of the program, we will have a closing. I do hope that you will complete the evaluation forms for me. We use these to plan future Science Cafes. And you all should have received tickets with numbers, and we will have a drawing for door prizes at the end as well. We're going to take just a few minutes for you to engage with the people that you're sitting with in case you haven't met them yet. So if you don't know someone at your table, maybe tell them your name, your major, your classification, and what attracted you to this program, and we're going to do this in 2 minutes. So let's go. Okay, let's move back into our program. So, trivia question number 1. Black bears were once prevalent across North America, including Oklahoma, but by the early 1900s, sightings became rare. What led to their comeback? Protection is one guess. You have a guess back here? A push in the field of conservation. And we have another guess back here. Setting aside parks and land for them to live upon. Those are all good guesses, but those are not what I found. So here's the answer that you can read. Did anybody get it close? I don't think so. Okay. Oh. Okay, so one of our speakers says that you would have gotten this right after the presentation had I waited. All right, so we didn't have anyone who got the first trivia question. Let's try the second one. Name the 3 species of bears in North America. I need hands. Okay, back here.
Black bear, brown bear, and grizzly bear.
No. Yes. Black bear, brown bear, and polar bear. I don't think that's what my slide says. Okay, here we go. Let's check it out. Yes, indeed, she got the answer correct. The 3 species are black bear, brown bears, and polar bears. What type of bears are grizzly bears? Are they brown? Okay. All right, the last trivia question's coming up here. What weapons are permitted for bear hunting in Oklahoma? I need to see a hand. Okay, yes. Bow, that's one of them. Muzzle loader, that's the other one. Okay, I think we have 2 people who got that one right, so we'll give both of them. Those are phone holders, by the way, if you want to hold that up. Okay, so now we'll move into our program. Oh, I did mean to show you this slide. So bear archery season starts October 1st and runs through October 15th, and bear muzzleloader season starts October 28th and runs through November 5th. The upcoming science cafes will be October 10th, November 7th, and November 14th. Just so you have that information. And you can sign the email list and receive email notices about science cafes on your way out. All right. Okay, our first speaker this evening is Ms. Sara Lyda, and she is a senior research specialist for the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management. Sara's Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Sciences is from Auburn University, and she earned her master's degree in Wildlife Ecology here at Oklahoma State University. At OSU, black bear research started in 2001, and Sara was the first student at OSU to be involved in this research. She told me that also as an undergraduate student at Auburn, she was involved in several research projects. So Sara Lyda will be our first speaker. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the second speaker now too. Dr. Sue Fairbanks earned her bachelor's degree in science from Nebraska Wesleyan University, her master's in science from Colorado State University, and her doctorate from the University of Kansas. She is also in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management. Dr. Fairbanks came to OSU from Iowa State University in 2013. Her research focus primarily has been large mammals, including bison, elk, and bighorn sheep, And then in Oklahoma, her research focus has been on predatory large mammals. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Miss Sara Lyda, this evening.
Thank you. Is my speaker on good? Okay, so the first thing that we would like to do tonight is to acknowledge and thank the current and past graduate students on the Black Bear Project. Morgan Fander, Emily Arts, both received their master's degrees, and Danny Yacklin received her Ph.D. degree while working on the Black Bear research. We have 3 current graduate students here in the room, and we'd like to ask for them to please stand up. Erica Perez, Elliot Lustig, and new to the group is Maddie Cleary. And so we'd like to give them a round of applause because without their hard work and dedication, we wouldn't be able to assist in the sound management of such an incredible species. So we're just going to cover a little bit of a background about black bear biology and ecology in Oklahoma. They are a long-lived Iteroparous species, which means that they live late into their 20s or can live late into their 20s in unhunted populations, and they reproduce multiple times throughout that lifetime. So an example of this is our bear. I don't have a pointer here. This is Bertha, and she entered our project in 2001, and this year, as a 22-year-old, Bertha gave birth to 3 healthy female cubs. We kind of like her a lot. So the name black bear would insinuate that all members of this species are black in color. But the truth is, in particular here in Oklahoma, it's common to find variations in that coat color. So we do have black bears, but we also have a chocolatey brown color that we find regularly, and they also can be kind of a cinnamon reddish color. So when you hear people say, oh, do we have brown bears in Oklahoma, that's probably the reason for that. The other thing that we find quite prevalent in these populations in both the areas that we work in is a chest blaze that you see in that bottom left-hand corner. That female and that cub have that white patch on their chest. And that can actually vary quite widely. It can just be a few little white hairs on the chest, or it can be this showy, splashy patch of white that can be in various shapes. Our Oklahoma bears can actually be pretty large. The adult female bears range from 150 pounds to 250 pounds, and the males range from approximately 350 to 450 pounds. But we've actually documented females well over 300 pounds, and we have one male in the southeastern part of the state that for the past 2 years has maxed out our 500-pound scales. So how do they get to be so big? By eating nuts and berries, of course. Black bears are large carnivores, but a very small portion of their diet here in Oklahoma consists of meat. So when they first emerge from their dens in late March through April and early May, they have to actually rely on the young new growth of vegetation and leftover acorns from the previous fall. As the summer progresses and the berries start to ripen, they'll shift a little bit. While continuing to eat some of that vegetation, they will shift over and start focusing on soft-mast and colonial insects. And then in the fall, they rely quite heavily on acorns to help pack on the pounds to prepare for denning season. They are opportunistic and quite handy, quite adaptable, especially when it comes to finding easy food sources. And so in Oklahoma, it's quite common for landowners and hunters to use wildlife feeders to make it easier for them to be able to view deer and other wildlife species. And we have found that Oklahoma black bears use these supplemental food sources, in particular when their natural food sources are scarce. They will also take advantage of bird feeders and pet food and garbage in suburban areas. So if you happen to live in bear country, it's really best for you to keep any food items or anything that smells tasty to bears up at night when they're going to most likely be the most active. So black bears typically begin to breed between the ages of 3 and 5 years old and have their babies at that point. Their breeding season in Oklahoma begins around middle of May and continues through July, but they have delayed implantation. So these females have these fertilized eggs that become blastocysts, but then they suspend further production until approximately November, at which point that blastocyst will then implant and begin to form. And gestation is only about 60 days. So the females will actually have their cubs in the dens in January to early February. They typically have 1 to 3 cubs here in Oklahoma, and those newborn cubs only weigh about 8 to 12 ounces when they're born. But because the mother's milk is so nutritional, packed full of nutrients, by the time they leave those dens in April, they will be 6 to 8 pounds. Now, female bears are the primary contributors to population growth in black bear populations. So because of delayed implantation, the body condition of the female actually determines if she has cubs and how many she will have if she does have them. Keep in mind, while she is denning, she does not eat or drink. So her body condition and those fat stores have to sustain her and those cubs for several months. Now the cubs are born in January, and then they remain with their mother for a full year and will den with her that following winter. And then when they emerge from that den as yearlings, the mother will be ready to breed again. So those cubs are those yearlings are approximately a year and a half old when all of a sudden they're kicked off on their own and they have to be real bears. Now the presence of males at that time, because they're going to be coming around and they want to breed with mom, is going to contribute to the dispersal of these little yearlings. And those young males will actually disperse first and the farthest because of competition and because of older male threats. But the female actually allows her female offspring to develop home ranges close to and overlapping with her own home range. So we just covered this. I was going to say, so how do we get bears here in Oklahoma? And as it turns out, the geographic range historically included Oklahoma and Arkansas. But the answer is it was overharvest from the earlier settlers and habitat loss that led to their decline and near extirpation in the early 1900s. So Arkansas Game and Fish captured between 1958 and 1968 250 black bears from Minnesota and Canada and relocated them into the Ozark and Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. Now that introduction or reintroduction was so successful that by 1980, they actually opened their very first bear hunting season in the Ouachitas. Now those populations in Arkansas continue to grow, and because the Ozarks and the Ouachitas extend into Oklahoma, the bears moved west. And the Ouachita population was the first one to expand into Oklahoma. So in 2001, we began our very first bear research in Oklahoma and the Ouachitas. After 8 years of research, the data determined that that population could sustain a hunting season. So in 2009, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation opened its very first bear hunting season in 4 counties of the Ouachitas. Now, it'd be easy to assume that as the Ouachita population grows, it's going to expand north and west. But in fact, genetic analyses from Arkansas and Oklahoma bears indicates that these are 2 distinct populations. So the bears, there is some east and west movement, but at this point, there is no north and south movement between the populations. So our the source populations for Oklahoma are from Arkansas. Now, because these are 2 distinct populations, it's important for us to note the differences and similarities between the regions that they exist in so that we can also recognize the fact that they need to be managed separately. As you can see in this map, the Ouachitas provide large contiguous blocks of forested habitat. All that green, that's the forested habitat. There's a lower human population, and the private lands are fewer and they're fragmented by public land. So this means, or should mean, that there's less availability of the supplemental food sources that I talked about earlier, like the wildlife feeders and that kind of thing. The other interesting thing to note is, because of when this population recolonized in the Ouachitas, game cameras were not very common at that point, and so it's likely that their existence or occurrence was not documented as thoroughly as it might be today. Now, the Ozarks, in contrast, are primarily privately owned, and you can see that the forested habitat here is highly fragmented by a higher human population. But most of these privately owned properties also contain those wildlife feeders that I spoke about earlier. And most of those wildlife feeders also have game cameras at them. So the occurrence of black bears in this region has been highly documented and reported since its beginning. So we began our first work in the Ozark region of Oklahoma in 2011, and then we had the opportunity to reinstate our research in the Ouachita region in 2014. We run trap lines of 8 to 12 traps throughout the summer months in different areas, and we use culvert traps, which is up in that left corner with the little bear climbing on it. Culvert traps, which has the bear with the donut walking out of it. Obviously, that one didn't work. the barrel trap with the little bear crawling on it, and then these bucket snares. So what that little bear is doing is reaching in for bait, and it's going to grab that bait, and then it will be cabled to a tree carefully with its paw. So we use these different methods based on where we're trapping and the safety of individuals that might be helping and for the bears. Once we have a bear in a trap, we assess what we estimate the weight to be, and we typically use an 8-foot-long aluminum syringe pole to sedate them. Once they are safely sedated, we pull them out of the traps and we begin to monitor their vital signs. We will continue to do that every 10 to 15 minutes throughout our workups, and those workups typically take about an hour. So once we're sure that the bear is handling the sedation carefully and safely, then we proceed to mark the individuals. So we give ear tags to all captured animals. The females get pink ear tags and the males get yellow. Unfortunately, we couldn't find blue ones for the males. But they also receive lip tattoos with numbers that correspond to their ear tag numbers, so that they're marked in a couple of different ways. As it turns out, cubs like to pull out mom's ear tags pretty frequently. We use iridium satellite collars on as many females as possible and select males. The point of these collars is to collect reproduction and survival information, and those females give us that important information, but we can also get home range estimates and then also assess what their habitat use is in both regions by using these collars. While we have them in hand, our only way of officially aging them, is by removing a tiny vestigial premolar tooth, and we send it to a lab, and they'll slice it very thinly, and then they'll have, it's called cementum annuli analyses, and there will be rings in that tooth, very similar to aging a tree. And so that's how we get the ages for all of our bears and can assess the age distribution within these populations. Beyond that, we're scientists, so we collect as much information as we can. We take hair and tissue samples for future genetic analysis, and then a heap of different morphological measurements before we send them on their way. So our methods for trapping and for working up bears is similar in both areas, but Dr. Fairbanks is going to explain that the results that we've gotten from these studies show that these populations are very different populations. John?
Okay, did I get this turned on? Is it working? Okay. So in comparing the trapping results from our two study populations, it's pretty clear based on the bottom line that there are a lot more bears in southeast Oklahoma. Our trap success there was 1 bear per 16 trap nights, whereas in the Oklahoma Ozarks, it was 1 bear per 50 trap nights. So we really do have a lot of captures in the southeast. This last summer, I think it was 71 captures, right? So it's not 71 different individuals. Our method of estimating population size depends on actually recapturing some of the same marked individuals many times. So 71 captures, not 71 individuals. But the makeup of the populations is very different too. If you look at the top row, you can see that in the Ozarks, there are 2.4 times as many males as there are females in that population, whereas in the Ouachitas, there are slightly fewer males than females. And as Sarah indicated before, it's the females that are important for population growth because they're the ones that produce the cubs. So the female numbers are the ones we want to maximize in the population if we want the population to grow or even be stable. Also, the age of the bears, the average age of the bears in the Ozarks is younger than in the Ouachitas. Both males and females in the Ozark area, the average age is only 3 years old. That's really young, just getting to be reproductive. In the Ouachitas, the average age of females is 5.5, and as Sarah indicated, we do have some very old females that are still producing cubs. And the male population is still pretty young, lots of young males in that population. Now, these are some examples of what we do with the satellite locations from the radio collars. So we can construct seasonal home ranges for individuals, and this happens to be an example that Elliot put together of a bear named Peaches. This is her home range. And the upper left graph, the small green circle there is the core area. That's where she spends most of her time. And then as you go farther and farther out with bigger and bigger shapes, that is including more and more of her radio locations. So we're able to look at her home range overall and then the places that she specifically focuses in on. And then down in the lower right-hand corner, we can overlay that home range on maps that show different things. So in this case, it's vegetation cover. And so Elliot, blue is, so dry oak woodland is the blue, and green is dry music oak forest. So she is, if you kind of compare the two graphs, she's spending a lot of her time in the blue areas, in that vegetation type. But we can also look at where they're spending their time in relation to elevation, in relation to distance to roads or distance to towns or human residences and that kind of thing. So we can get a lot of information from this. And another thing that Elliot is going to be particularly focusing on in his study is the role that habitat fragmentation plays in the habitat use by these bears. In other words, Sarah had mentioned how the habitat is very fragmented in the Ozark area, whereas in the southeast you have a lot more large, continuous tracts of woodland. So the bears, if you think about it, are moving back into a place that bears used to exist in Oklahoma, but now that habitat is very different than when they were here before. It's highly modified by humans. So we're interested in how the bears are basically inserting themselves back into this landscape that is so highly modified. The other type of signal that is in the collars, and actually if you guys want to start taking around the collars so people can get a look at them, on these collars, the big box at the bottom holds all of the mechanics of the transmitters, but the other type of signal besides the one that goes up to the satellite and gives us a GPS location is battery powered, and that's just a VHF signal that we can track manually on the ground with antennas. So we use that VHF antenna and signal to find the females after they have gone into their dens in the winter. And when they've gone into the dens, usually we can't get the satellite signals anymore at all, but we can still get that VHF signal, so we can track them and find them. And then we go visit the den after the cubs have been born, and tranquilize the female, and then we can change the collar out or adjust the collar or anything we have to do with the female. But it also gives us an opportunity to record the number of cubs that she's had, the sex of the cubs, and the bear cubs are too small to mark like we do the adults. So instead of giving them an external mark, we give them a little pit tag, like they mark dogs with, microchip dogs with. So we do that with the bear cubs, and then when they grow up and we catch them again later on, we know who they are, where they came from, how far they've moved from where they were born, and get all kinds of information from them. And then we also collect hair samples from the cubs, and that gives us genetic material for possible future studies. And of course, the job of snuggling the bear cubs and keeping them warm while we're working with the mother is a tough job, but we can usually find some people to help out with that. So some of the results comparing the reproduction in the two different study areas. The average litter size in the Ozarks is just under 2 cubs, whereas in the Ouachitas we have lots and lots of females that are giving birth to triplets. So the average litter size down there is 2.5. Now the fecundity only takes into account the number of female cubs that are born. So it's much lower in the Ozarks, partly because they have a lower litter size, but also because they tend to produce a higher ratio of male cubs than what we see in the southeast. And again, for our population growth estimates, it's the females that we look at, because they're the ones that are actually producing the cubs. The cub survival in the two places is not that different. And the way we determine whether the cubs have survived for a year is we go back and visit their mom's den again a year later, and the now 1-year-olds are denning with their mom again. Okay. So the population in the Ozarks area is much smaller, and it's much more sparse. So in addition to our capture-recapture method of estimating the population size, we decided to also do a use a genetic method. And this method is non-invasive. In other words, we don't have to actually capture the animals. But what we did is gridded out the study area, as you can see in the bottom right, and each one of those blue dots represents a hair snare that we established in that grid cell. Now, a hair snare is just 2 strands of barbed wire strung really tight around 3 or 4 or 5 trees in the area, and then we hang in the center of it some scent lures, so raspberry extract or maple syrup or anything sweet, or sardines, or both, all of them. And then when the bear comes in, either between or over or under the wires to check out the good smelling stuff, they leave hair for us on the barbs. Sometimes they actually will leave even more hair because they like to scratch on the barbs where they're going around the tree. So they'll actually use that as a scratching post and leave even more hair for us. So then we can collect the hair samples, and the hair follicles actually contain DNA. So we can extract the DNA and identify individuals genetically. So the first time we identify an individual genetically from these samples. It's similar to catching and marking an animal. And then the next time we detect that same individual genetically, whether it's on the same hair snare or another hair snare, that's a recapture. So that's a way that we were trying to increase our sample size since the population is pretty sparse and small. So based on both of the methods, physical capture and genetic methods, we estimated that there are about 77 to 82 black bears in the Oklahoma Ozarks. Pretty small population so far. The estimate is still in progress for southeastern Oklahoma. We haven't been working there as long this time, and we've got not only the Ouachita National Forest, but also some of the outer areas, so it's a much larger area that we're trapping. But Erica's been trapping out there for 2 years now, and so within a year she should have a population estimate for, right? for southeast Oklahoma. Now, we were able, with all of the data that we collected from reproduction and survival of the different ages of black bears and sex ratio and that kind of thing, to estimate the population growth rate for the different populations. And on this graph, population growth rate is on the vertical axis, and that red dotted line is the growth rate. That means the population is not growing, but it's not declining either. So a population growth rate of 1 means you have a stable population. Technically, it means that every female black bear is, over her lifetime, leaving 1 female offspring that survives to reproduce as well. So the Ozarks population growth rate, you can see, is below that line. That means that based on reproduction alone, this population is declining. So the only thing that's maintaining this population right now is the continued movement of young male bears from Arkansas, and that's also why we have such a skewed sex ratio and young age in this population. Right now, there aren't enough adult females, reproducing females, to sustain the population. And this was an important bit of information that we could provide to the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, because they had been getting a lot of calls to start a hunting season in the Oklahoma Ozarks area, in those counties in that area. Right now, this data suggests that biologically, the population can't sustain a hunting season. Now, the next bar is for a current estimate of population growth for the Ouachitas in southeast Oklahoma, and that is about 1.04. That suggests that the population is growing slowly, and that is with the hunting season. So this population, we could tell that ODWC is doing well with the hunting season as it is right now, and it's still even growing a little bit. The last bar on the right is the original population growth from when Sara did her research on the population in 2001-2003. That was before the hunting season. And so you can see from that bar that the population was actually growing pretty quickly. For a black bear population, that's a really fast growth rate at 1.14. So the hunting season and just the establishment, maturing of the population slowed down the growth rate, but the population is able to maintain slow growth even with the hunting season. Okay, Erica has also put together some information comparing the bears that we capture in our capture methods to the bears that are harvested. And the top graph shows the age of the bears that were captured in the light green and that were harvested in the dark green. And you can see by comparison that hunters are taking a lot more young bears than older bears. Whereas in the capture pool, we're catching a lot more older bears than what are being harvested. And if you look down at the diagrams of the bears, the captured bears in this estimate, about even, slightly more males than females being captured recently. But among the harvested bears, they're harvesting a lot more males than females. Another good thing as far as the population growth is to take the males and leave the females there to reproduce. Now, another way to look at this is to look at the proportion of the total that each of the different age groups makes up. So here, if you look at the subadult males in blue, in the capture, they make up about 15% of the captured bears. But in the harvested bears, they make up about 25% of the harvest. So it's young males that are primarily being harvested. And so in comparison to how we think they occur in the actual population. Okay, so going back to the Ozarks population, we were able to demonstrate that the population in the Ozarks area is not currently self-sustaining. It could not maintain a harvest at this point. But another really important aspect of the whole issue is the human side. So our next study, which Maddie Cleary is going to be working on, and we're going to be working with Omkar Yoshi, is the human dimensions side. So we'll be looking at what the attitudes of the people that live in these different areas, both the area that doesn't have a hunting season but has bears, the area that has bears and has a hunting season, and we're even going to look at extreme northeast Oklahoma that doesn't have bears, but they might someday, and doesn't have a hunting season. So we're going to look at the attitudes and try to get a handle on the social acceptance capacity for black bears in that region. And so that's going to be Maddie's study. She just started this fall, so we're just getting started on that aspect of it. But then we will continue monitoring the populations as they grow and change and become established in the case of the Ozarks. And we'll continue to look in the near future at the impacts of the hunting season and how that's impacting the growth and spread of the southeast black bear population. So going forward, as Sarah mentioned, we need to make sure that we can provide the science to manage the Ozark and the Ouachita populations independently, because they are very different populations right now, and they live in very different environments right now. And we'll see what people think about them in the two different areas as well. And so we hope to continue the research so we can determine when this new population in the Ozarks becomes established and becomes a mature population, if it can, given the resources and the fragmentation in that area. So with this study, we've worked with a lot of people from the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation and a lot of the staff people at the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management and the co-op unit at the university. We've had a lot of summer research assistants that have been out helping catch the bears and do other projects with the bears. But we also want to give a very special thanks to the private landowners and the local cooperators in the counties where we do a lot of the work on private land, primarily in the Ozarks area. Without their cooperation and assistance, we wouldn't be able to do this. So with that, I think we'll end, and if anybody has any questions, we can answer them. Any questions? Yes.
So there was a reference made to that the number of offspring depends on the body condition. And the assumption was that based on the plasticity plantation, right?
Yes.
So how do you know it's not controlled at population level and that it's controlled at the plantation level? What's
size more influenced by the number of ova that are ovulated or by the number of blastocysts that implant in the uterus? Have you seen that information?
I have not.
I haven't either. That's
How about
something
you,
we'll have to
Erica?
look into.
Anybody else?
We'll have to look into
That's a
that.
really,
Animals that do that at ovulation.
Right.
I know of an example where you can selectively implant.
right,
So I was curious.
sure.
Yeah, pronghorn are like that too. They'll actually shed up to 15 ova, and they are all fertilized, but only 4 ever implant, and a maximum of 2 are born. So there are a lot of processes in between them.
Hey there, great talk. You both mentioned the pivotal importance of the female in the reproduction, and as a male mammal, I will stipulate the importance of females in reproduction. But I was curious, given the pattern after the yearlings come out and that at the mating season, could you tell me a little bit about the behavioral pattern of the mating process? Do the females mate with multiple males? Do the males mate with multiple females? What is that?
Do you want us to repeat
Both.
it? Okay, so we need to repeat the question.
Okay.
So he's asking if, what the mating process is, if the females only mate with one male and that kind of thing. And yes, the males will cover more than one female and the females will mate with more than one male. And in fact, within one litter, those cubs could actually have different fathers because of the delayed implantation. But they will stay together for a short amount of time until that female is receptive. They'll breed and then they'll move apart and somebody else will come along during that period.
Is there a correlation between the two populations here in Oklahoma and those in Arkansas in terms of how it grows around?
So the question was, is there a correlation between Arkansas and Oklahoma for the two populations as far as their population growth and other issues? We keep close tabs with the person that's kind of heading up the research in Arkansas, and the Arkansas population is more dense than ours at this point because it's been there longer and it's a lot more established. So their Ouachita population is also older than our Ouachita population. So yeah, there are correlations, but they're a lot farther along, of course.
The other interesting thing that the Arkansas biologist, we've been able to work with him on, is the fact that they too have some of the similar issues in terms of the population in the Ozarks and having human dimensions issues or social carrying capacity type issues in that region because it is also more heavily inhabited by humans. So we're really working very closely with them to figure out, how we can learn from what they've been through as we start laying the groundwork for our.
That's true mainly in northwest Arkansas, that area?
Yes.
So, as you know that in Ozarks, the male population is more. So, and you showed that there has been an effort to introduce more males in that area. So, why not try to introduce more females of reproductive age to increase the female population in that area?
So at this point, the question is, there are more males than females in the Ozark population, and so why don't we introduce more females into the Ozark area? Right now, the ODWC hasn't been doing any reintroductions, so basically we get what Arkansas, what comes across the border from Arkansas. And one of the things that Sara mentioned was what the young animals do when they first leave their mother, and the males are the ones that move out and the females stay real close. So when you have a new population that's founding, at first you got males, and it takes a while for the female part of the population to kind of move into that area. I think that as far as going ahead and introducing any females intentionally, we need to know what the people in the area want or don't want.
And to assess what the habitat can hold as well.
Right.
Which is something Elliot's helping us with.
Yeah.
Well, all this concern about state budgets and money and all that, how is the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife and Conservation, how is it doing in regards to financial support from the state?
Budget-wise, as far as our research?
As far as the department and as far as.
Right. So most of the research money that comes from, well, in our case, all of the research funding that comes from the ODWC is actually federal money that's passed through the ODWC, and it comes from the Pittman-Robertson Act, which was an act in the 1930s that placed an excise tax on ammunition and sporting weapons and things like that. And so at this point, the ODWC isn't directly contributing the money. It's coming from the federal government through the Pittman-Robertson Fund.
That sounds good. Bravo, Pittman Robinson.
Yeah, you know, an interesting thing though,
Great.
the Pittman-Robertson Act was established in the 1930s at a 10% rate. Today, it's 11%. So in that amount of time, it has not increased very much. But as long as people keep buying ammunition and weapons, we'll have research.
We're doing our part.
Market and muzzle loaders.
Yeah.
Good, good.
Can I have a follow-up question to what she asked? How do you explain the gender disparity at biological level? You have 2 times more males than females, and you harvest more males. So logically, you would think that there should be more females, right?
Go ahead.
Okay, so he's asking how we explain the gender disparity, why there are so many more males than females. The harvest is actually in the Ouachita population, and down in the Ouachitas, we don't have that disparity. It's actually a closer to 1-to-1 or a little bit fewer males than females. And so while I can't quite explain why the females are in the Ozark region are having more male cubs, but in the grand scheme of things, our reason for the population itself having more males is because of those males dispersing from Arkansas over into Oklahoma. So they're not being affected by the hunting season just yet.
Yeah,
So do you see the same difference in the den surveys?
In the den,
Are the den surveys in the male, female, 1-to-1?
and
there are still a few more males born, but that's not unusual because males tend to have a higher mortality rate than the females. So it's not unusual for the sex ratio to be slightly male biased at birth.
Is there an explanation for why like there was such a higher capture rate for females? I noticed like in the 2 graphs there was like the females was like the far higher.
in the Ouachitas.
In the Ouachitas. So the question was, is there a reason why a higher percentage of the captures in the Ouachitas was female as opposed to male compared to the harvest, which is more males than females? Our previous graduate student, Morgan Vander, actually did a very controlled study of the efficiency of the traps, and our traps actually favor slightly captures of males. So we think that the difference is that there are just more females.
And the young males are the ones that typically come to bait during hunting seasons, so it kind of makes sense that oftentimes they're the ones that end up getting harvested as well.
They just don't have the experience.
I can add to that a little bit. A lot of our adult females are being captured in that big block of Washington National Forest, and like they were saying, the females can just disperse right next to their mothers. So we have a huge chunk of kind of females who's really great rare habitats. That's actually looking at a lot of our female habitats.
And that's the core area of that population, so I'm glad you brought that up. So that makes a lot of sense that our biggest base of the females would be in that particular area where we initially started our research.
And we expect, and Erica has been seeing, and Morgan before her, that we expect to see more males out on the fringes, out on the expanding edge of the population, and that's what we're seeing in the captures.
What about the human interaction with the general public and these bears? How dangerous is it to come across one, and have there been injuries or anything like that?
Can you go ahead and take that?
So he was asking, how dangerous is it to potentially have interactions with black bears here in Oklahoma? The general response that I give to people is you should always be cautious. I mean, these are wild mammals, they are large carnivores, but in general, they're going to be more afraid of you than you are of it. And where the problems tend to arise is when food is involved. So if you happen to be camping and you have your food not secured properly, things like that. As far as I know, we have not had any serious issues in Oklahoma with any injuries or things like that. I do know that there have been hunters that have taken bears because they were like during turkey season or something and they were afraid that the bear was stalking them. Most likely that bear was just really curious about what that turkey sound was and maybe about the Snickers bar that's in your pocket. But in general, here in Oklahoma, knock on wood so far, we've not had any issues, and that is something that we're working with the Wildlife Department about to try to inform the general public and the folks that are going to be using these areas, you know, how to be in bear country and how to live in bear country.
And in New Mexico, they have been on scout ranch. Kids will have bears around, and because of the Snickers bar,
Mm-hmm.
they have
Yeah.
So he's mentioning a scout ranch in New Mexico, Boy Scout Ranch, I assume, where they've had issues with food issues, basically, with bears, but nothing horrible has occurred yet. We actually work in the Ozark region. We work with a scout ranch there, and so they'll tell us when they're going to have their big groups coming in, and typically on those weekends, we do end up with bear sightings during that time, even in this area with, you know, a lower density of bears than probably what you're dealing with out there. But so far, so good.
And our bears don't even eat small mammals and things like that. I mean, we've done some food habit studies, and they have in Arkansas as well, and they're well over 80% vegetarian. Most of the animals that they eat are ants and bees. In other areas, though, it's very different. I mean, we've got a lot of good bear food in terms of the berries and the acorns and that kind of thing. In other parts of the country, especially in the West, they do have to rely on meat because they just don't have what we have.
We have a question back here.
Do you think we'll ever get black bears west central soon, like here in the water region? If they're moving on west, or is it too populated here?
I tried to see one on my place today, but it just wasn't a black bear. Well, we have definitely had stray young males that have popped over even into like the Manford area. But my suspicion or my thoughts are there's really just not enough continuous good habitat over from there to over here to really sustain a very much of a population over this direction. We do have some bears out in western Oklahoma, but most of those bears are most likely coming from, you know, New Mexico, Colorado area, and just somewhat transient through there.
Occasionally, our young bears have had to be removed from some of the towns, Wagner, Muskogee, Tahlequah, but it's usually young bears that'll kind of come into town and then they get scared and they go up a tree. So the ODWC has to go in and tranquilize them and move them out. And then they wander for another year, and eventually they settle down.
It's a rough life being a young bear.
You mentioned that bears are mostly like herbivorous here and vegetation. Do you know why it is that they would prefer that over the meat, or just that it's so abundant?
So she's asking if we know why the bears here in Oklahoma are mostly herbivorous or vegetarian as opposed to preferring meat. My answer would be because they're basically kind of lazy and they know what packs on the pounds somehow in terms of caloric content, and so they're going to go for the easiest food sources available, and we do have plentiful food sources when it comes to hard and soft mast and things like that. So they were built to be able to dig into those colonial nests, and they were built to eat all of these other vegetation type things, but in these other areas like Dr. Fairbanks mentioned, there's just not the availability of those things. So then they have to shift and eat salmon or eat deer fawns or something like that. But ultimately, they're pretty much in for an easy meal. They want something that they can get lots of good food in their bellies but not have to work too hard at it. Do you have any input?
No,
I just want to ask, how much genetic variation is there in that Ozark population? Are you ever concerned about genetic bottleneck, or is there enough movement between them and Arkansas, or within themselves together?
that's a really good question. So her question was, are we concerned about the genetic variation in the Ozark populations since it is a small population, or is there enough input and movement of bears from Arkansas, Ozarks, and interaction with our bears? At this point, we haven't looked into that yet, but they have done genetic studies of the Arkansas Ozarks bears, and they have a good amount of genetic diversity, and that's partly because of how they did the reintroductions in the first place. They brought bears from multiple areas, so they had a good amount of genetic variation. But they actually determined that in one of the areas, Ozarks or the Wachitas, they can still see the signature of remnant native Arkansas bears in one population and in the other population again. But it might be something that we look at if they became isolated.
What's the social structure of these bears? Are they solitary animals which tolerate other animals, or there are established social hierarchies and so on? And I saw that map there, lots of bears in the same area.
So he's asking what the social structures of bears are. Do they hang out in groups, or are they solitary? In general, they're solitary except for females with cubs or yearlings. Now, during breeding season, of course, then you get the males and females together. The other thing that I have noticed, while in general they would prefer to be solitary, the prevalence of the wildlife feeders and the supplemental food sources, I feel like during certain times of the year, that encourages them to be more willing to feed in groups. And I assume it would be that way if you had isolated food sources in nature as well, but we just find there are so many wildlife feeders that I've got landowners who give me pictures where there are 3 or 4 what look like large males in a circle laying in a corn pile eating together. And that's just not something you would normally see in the wild, I wouldn't think. So that, I think the supplemental feeding is definitely affecting that social structure just a little bit. Okay, so he asked if there's any sexual dimorphism that hunters could use to tell whether they were hunting or wanting to harvest a male versus a female to protect those females, and whether there were any protections in the Wachita season to protect the females down there. Do you want me to take this one?
It's difficult to tell the males from the females by sight when they're coming into bait. The main way to do it is if they have a cub with them. And the hunters are encouraged not to shoot bears that have cubs with them.
It's in the law,
But
actually.
What's?
It's in the law.
Oh,
They're-
is it?
Yes, if they have cubs, they are not allowed to shoot that bear. But proving whether cubs are there or not is a little difficult.
We know we've had bears with radio collars that have cubs that have been harvested.
Now, that's not,
foolproof.
and that's not to say that it's all the hunter's fault either. I mean, we can, it is difficult to tell. If you spend a lot of time watching bears over bait, there are certain things you notice that the females tend to have narrower skulls and narrower heads, even if they're larger. The males get these big wide heads, but it is definitely not a foolproof thing. I mean, we've gotten pictures on our cameras and think, oh, we're gonna get a female, and it turns out it's some rangy male. But as far as regulations, the Wildlife Department definitely attempts to protect those females with cubs, but it's just a very difficult rule to enforce.
If the cubs are up a tree and not coming to the bait, we wouldn't know that she has them.
And at that point, it would be very difficult, probably unless she's laying on her back, waving her arms at you, to actually see. She wouldn't be lactating as much, and her coat would be thick enough that it would be a little more difficult to see. They would be weaning at that point, so. Now, we could get the Wildlife Department to ask them to change the regulations and have them not shoot our collared bears. And that would save us a whole lot of time and trouble, because most of our collared bears are females, and we put a heck of a lot of time and money into getting them collared, and we get a ridiculous amount of great information from that. So that is something that we would really like to see happen, is to protect.
You want to get these colored back?
Actually, we've gotten back and some we have not gotten back. But at this point, like I said, I mean, they're allowed to shoot those collared bears, and so the ones that we didn't get back, there was some question as to whether it had already broken off before they shot the bear or not. So.
Sarah brought some things to look at here too, in addition to the collars. We've got a bear skull, and she's got a cast of a bear print, and some slides of the cross sections of teeth. So if
Okay.
you're interested in looking at any of those things, they are up here as well.
She asked me to hold these up so everybody can see, and then you can come by and look at them. This is a skull of a young male that I believe this is the one that he actually got hit by a vehicle and had to be put down. This is from the Ozark region. This is a plaster cast all the way from Alabama, lower Alabama, and it shows that they have 5 toes. And then these will be much easier to see in person if you're interested in the aging process. These are the actual slides that we receive back with the cross sections of the teeth. And so while it's not as good as if we actually had a microscope sitting here, but you can at least come and kind of get a peek at what that looks like.
And if you want to look at the teeth of the bear skull, you can see that they are adapted very well for eating vegetation. The back teeth are flat, and they're chewing teeth, so that assists them in eating plant material.
And we've had a lot of great questions tonight, so thank you for coming, and don't leave yet. But let's thank our speakers, Dr. Fairbanks and